This page was created to teach Black history. Unfortunately, the American educational system was designed to exclude our real historical account, so we are here to dismantle it. It's time to enlighten those of us who have been kept in the dark. I am a Black man who didn't know enough about my own history, so I began to dig deeper and do my own research. Black history is American history, so I want people of all races and cultures to join together to learn our history as one. Here, I will share all of my findings. Please like, follow, share, and subscribe to Teaching Black History. This is the story of the Ocoee Massacre. Orange County, as well as the rest of Florida, had been politically dominated by Southern white Democrats since the end of the Reconstruction. But in the weeks leading up to the presidential election of 1920, African Americans throughout the South were registering to vote in record numbers. At the same time, the Ku Klux Klan was experiencing a revival and had established many new chapters since 1915. 3 weeks before Election Day, the Ku Klux Klan warned the African American community that not a single Negro would be permitted to vote. Judge John Moses Chaney, a Republican running for the United States Senate from Florida, had started a voter registration campaign to register African Americans to vote in Florida. Moss Norman and July Perry, both prosperous African American landowners in Ocoee, led the local voter registration efforts in Orange County, paying the poll tax for those who could not afford it. In an effort to preserve white one-party rule, the Ku Klux Klan marched in full through the streets of Jacksonville, Daytona, and Orlando to intimidate opponents. Colonel Sam Salisbury, a white supremacist and a member of the Ku Klux Klan, bragged about his involvement in the violent oppression and intimidation of African Americans attempting to vote in the previous 1920 election. He was one of the leaders of the events leading up to the Ocoee Massacre. He was injured in an attack he led on July Perry's home in Ocoee. African Americans were met with resistance from the white community when they attempted to vote on Election Day. Poll workers challenged whether African American voters were really registered. However, African Americans, including Moss Norman, persisted or were pushed and shoved away from the polls. Norman contacted Judge John Chaney, who told him that interference with voting was illegal and told him to write the names of the African Americans who were denied their constitutional rights, as well as the names of the whites who were violating them. Norman later returned to the polling place in Ocoee with a shotgun. Whether the shotgun was taken for Norman is not entirely clear, but whites at the polls drove off Norman using his own shotgun. The white community began to form a mob and paraded up and down the streets, growing more disorderly and unmanageable. The rest of the African Americans gave up on trying to vote and left the polling place. Later during the evening, Sam Salisbury, the former chief of police of Orlando, was called to lead a lynch mob to find and punish Moss Norman. He later proudly bragged about his part in the events. The white mob was on its way to Norman's home when someone informed them that their target had been seen at the home of July Perry. The mob, by then numbering about 100 men, arrived at Perry's house demanding that Perry and Norman surrender. When they received no answer, they attempted to break down the front door. Perry, who had been warned about the mob, fired gunshots from inside the home in self-defense. Exactly how many people were defending the house is uncertain. The whites estimated that there were several armed African Americans. Sam Salisbury knocked the back door open and was shot in the arm, becoming the first white casualties. 2 other whites, veterans, Elmer McDaniels and Leo Bogard, were killed when they also tried to enter through the back door. Their bodies were found hours later in the backyard. The white mob withdrew and put out a call for reinforcements to whites in Orlando and Orange County, either calling them by phone or sending for them by car. During the 2 to 3 hour lull while the whites were recruiting other men, July Perry, injured in the conflict, attempted to flee with the help of his wife into a cane patch. He was found by the white mob at dawn and arrested. After Perry was treated at a hospital for his wounds, he was taken by a white mob from a vehicle while being transferred to a jail. They lynched him and left his body hanging from a telephone post beside the highway. Norman was never found. With reinforcements, the white mob took the conflict to the rest of the African American community in northern Ocoee. The white paramilitary forces surrounded the northern Ocoee black community and laid siege to it. They set fire to rows of African American houses. Those inside were forced to flee and many were shot by whites. At least 20 buildings were burned in total, including every African American church, schoolhouse, and lodge room in the vicinity. African American residents fought back in an evening-long gunfight lasting until as late as 4:45 a.m. Their firearms later found in the ruins after the massacre ended. Eventually, black residents were driven into the nearby orange groves and swamps, forced to retreat until they were driven out of town. The siege of Ocoee claimed numerous African American victims. An African American carpenter was beaten and castrated. Maggie Gleanlack and her pregnant daughter died while hiding in her home. Their bodies were found partially burned underneath it. Roosevelt Barton, an African American hiding in July Perry's barn, was shot after the mob set fire to the barn and forced him to flee. Haiti Smith was visiting her pregnant sister-in-law in Ocoee when her sister-in-law's home was set afire. Smith fled, but her sister-in-law's family was killed while they hid and waited for help that never came. The African American residents of southern Ocoee, while not direct victims of the massacre, were later threatened into leaving. Most suspected that the massacre was planned so that whites could seize the property of prosperous African Americans for nothing. People in southern Ocoee were coerced by the threat of being shot and burned out if they did not sell out and leave. About 500 African Americans in total were rapidly driven out of Ocoee, resulting in its population being nearly all white. That fall, white residents had to work to harvest the citrus crop. 1 year later, in 1981, July Perry's body was found riddled with bullets and swinging on a telephone post by the highway. According to the Chicago Defender, his body was left near a sign reading, "This is what we do to niggers that vote." A local photographer was selling photos of Perry's body for 25 cents each. Several stores placed the photo on exhibition by their windows. No one was prosecuted for his murder. No one was ever held responsible for any of the deadly violence.